Hello and welcome back to Bookish. Today I want to do two book reviews. These are both books of short stories that I read this month. The first is Birds of America by Lorrie Moore, which I believe was published in 1998. And the second is Lot by Bryan Washington, which was published this year. So the first, Birds of America first. This is a collection of short stories which may or may not feature birds in each one. To be honest with you, birds are almost never the focal point of the story, but there are a lot of birds mentioned as kind of background things in the stories. Mostly these are stories about men and women, primarily women in relationships which they find in some way unfulfilling, and their search for some kind of meaning, something more important, something that to them feels more like real love. That's what most of these stories are about. Lorrie Moore is a well-known short story writer who has published numerous short stories in magazines like The New Yorker. This book, Birds of America, was a New York Times Best Book of the Year in 1998. She, in addition to publishing, I think, 3 or 4 books of short stories, she's also published 2 or 3 novels. She's taught writing at the University of Wisconsin and I believe at Vanderbilt. I think this was her 3rd collection of stories, and by all accounts, I think most people consider it to be her best. Lorrie Moore is a good writer. She has the power to create images, but more importantly, the power to create characters that seem familiar. They seem like people we know, even if their flaws are somewhat exaggerated and more called to our attention in the brief span of a story. She does not hesitate to expose their flaws, to expose their shortcomings, but she does so with humor oftentimes, which makes it seem like she sympathizes or empathizes with her characters. Most of her female characters are in some ways unfulfilled. They're unfulfilled professionally, they're unfulfilled in their relationship with their parents, they're unfulfilled in their relationship with men or their husbands, and most of the men in her stories are in some ways less intelligent, less educated, less mature than the women in most of the stories. That is true. I do have some favorite stories from this short story collection. Let's see. One is called, near the end, is called The Best Mother, which I thought was really powerful and effective. Another one involves the story of a couple whose child is diagnosed with cancer, and their kind of struggle to come to grips with that. I thought that was a really powerful story. There's a story called A Beautiful Grade, in which a college professor who is ethically compromised is always searching for a woman of some kind who can make him feel more complete, and never really find them, and always chasing after other women. That story I thought was really effective, particularly because one of the female characters in the story is a young student of his who he began to date after she left his class, and she is the voice of reason. I like that idea of a young person exerting and using their wisdom to kind of highlight the foolishness of an older character and the weakness of that older character. To me, these are stories, though, that are dated. No matter how beautifully written they are, and no matter how effective they might be, they are definitely from the time period of the 1990s. The characters are inwardly looking. They're almost obsessed with their own problems and things that have gone on in their own lives. And their problems are, feel like 90s kinds of problems, like infidelity and inability to get ahead at work, or, they just feel dated to that time period, of the late 1990s. I think all short stories run the risk of having that feel because they are more immediate. They have a tendency to be more topical. And so I get that impression from these stories. This is something I have to admit that these stories in this collection was somewhat disappointing to me. I'd hoped that I would find, that Lorrie Moore was an incredibly powerful short story writer, somebody I could go to and, read her short stories over and over again. And while I think these were good stories, I don't think Lorrie Moore is that person. She's not Edna O'Brien, who I started reading her short stories this year, and there's much more power and empathy in her stories. So, to me, this is a good book. I don't think it was a particularly great book. So the second book of short stories that I'm reviewing today are collected in this book called Lot. It's by Bryan Washington. These stories are all set in relatively poor neighborhoods, if not strictly impoverished neighborhoods of Houston. The title of each of the stories is the name of a street or a neighborhood or a recognizable area in Houston, and the stories are really grounded in Houston itself. About half of the stories follow one character and his family struggles on the east side of Houston, and they kind of collectively, I think, create kind of a novella feel to them. But they're every other story, and then the other half of the stories are freestanding and independent stories. Bryan Washington is a gay African-American writer who lives and writes in Houston. His stories have appeared in all kinds of magazines. His essays and stories have appeared in the New Yorker and other magazines like that. And he is a good writer. Most of the short stories in this collection, matter of fact, all the short stories in the collection deal with the problems of people living in the inner city. Problems like gentrification and drug use and unwanted pregnancies and violence and crime and poverty. These are problems, and neglect by city government. These are the problems that the characters in Lot have to deal with. A lot of the characters in Lot, though, are also gay young men who have to, also deal with those problems. So the stories in Lot, to me, vary a great deal in quality. And I think that's because Washington sometimes is trying too hard to make the stories poignant, to make the stories somewhat shocking. Sometimes it's because he's trying to make the stories too Houston, too identifiably Houston, and that kind of can be distracting, even as a person who lives in Houston and lives near Houston and recognizes some of those places and some of the reality that he depicts. And I'm not questioning the reality of what he's showing. It feels like he's straining sometimes to include those things in the stories. Also, that little kind of mini novella, Zelda, hush. Also, that kind of mini novella where you have the related stories that are every other story. I wish he'd just developed that further and turned that into an actual novel. As stories, individual stories, they don't work as the way he has it now as kind of a novella of themed stories that are connected. It's not complete enough. So I found that to be kind of a problem. There are good stories in Lot. I really liked the story Wall, which is named after a street, kind of a neighborhood near the Arts District of Houston. I thought that was a good and effective story. But my favorite story was the second story in the collection, and that story is called A-Leaf. I thought A-Leaf was just a remarkable story and really an achievement. And I think it's worth reading all on its own, because I really was blown away by the power of that story. And what Washington does in that story that I found so impressive is he turns this whole community of people, most of whom are unnamed, he turns this whole community of people and their diversity and their differences, he turns that community of these people living in this one apartment complex in the A-Leaf area north of Houston, he turns that neighborhood, or that apartment complex and that community into a character. As a matter of fact, that community is the main character, I think, in the story and drives the action of the story. And to me, that was a real achievement. I thought that story was really good. So what I would say about Lot is that what you probably would expect from someone's first collection of stories. They are uneven. A-Leaf is really good, and there's other stories that I think just don't work and are kind of failures, and they're good stories mixed in. There's a lot of good writing, there's a lot of good ideas, but it's not always executed particularly well. So I would call Lot as a whole an okay book, even though I think the story of A-Leaf is truly outstanding. Anyway, if you've read these two books, know anything about these two authors, I look forward to seeing your comments in the comments section, and as always, thank you for watching.